Hi, thanks for stopping by again. Last week, if you remember, we talked about my third great grandmother, Sophronia Elvira Hatch Tidwell, and our story took her from Vermont to Nauvoo, where at the age of 17 she met and married a man by the name of Peter Tidwell, who was then 21 years of age. And today I'd like to pick up the story, tell you a little bit about Peter Tidwell, who is my third great grandfather. And so we're going to now kind of back up a little bit, tell you a little bit about Peter, and then we'll pick up the lives of both Sophronia and Peter together. And that's what we want to talk about today. So Peter was actually born in Illinois, the state of Illinois, in the year 1831 to Absalom, that ends with an M, Absalom Tidwell and Elizabeth McBride. Those were his parents. Now, not long after Peter was born, Absalom began developing the idea that they needed to move. And where they wanted to go, there were lands that were opening up in a place called Iowa. And the word was that this was a very fertile and choice ground and great for farming. And up till now, Iowa had been primarily wilderness area and known for numerous bands of Indians. So things were opening up. On the banks of the Mississippi River, the United States met with the Indians to end what was called the Black Hawk War. And as part of the payment to end that war, it was agreed that the United States would pay $20,000 a year for the next 30 years, and as well as anybody who lost their life. Let's say some of the Indians were killed in the Black Hawk War. The United States agreed that they would give cattle, salt, pork, flour, and corn, and all debts above around $40,000 accumulated debt would be forgiven. And this allowed for the expansion of the United States into Iowa. And that happened in February of 1833. And come June of 1833, that is when Peter's father, Absalom, decided it was time to head to Iowa. And so they did. June 1st, 1833, they set out for Iowa. But in addition to the new settlers that moved into Iowa, there was somebody else that moved into Iowa, and these were the missionaries from the Mormon Church. And not long after their arrival, Absalom and Elizabeth heard about the gospel and were baptized also in 1833. So within months of after arriving in Iowa, they were baptized. At the time, Peter was 3 years old. The family remained in Iowa for a number of years, and more children were born, and finally, Absalom took his family to a place known as Jackson County, Missouri. And Jackson County, the bitterness and the hostilities seemed to grow against the church, and so many were forced to leave Missouri and go to Illinois. And part of this was due to a man by the name of Lilburn W. Boggs, who was the governor of Missouri. And on October 27th of 1838, he issued what became known as the Extermination Order. And in part, it read, and I quote, "The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state, if necessary, for the public peace." And we just lost Peter there, and he's back. Okay, so with thousands of other saints, the Tidwells worked their way to Nauvoo, and they stayed in that area for a number of years. In 1845, Peter's father, Absalom, passed away. Absalom is actually my fourth great-grandfather, and he left Elizabeth and 3 sons and 4 daughters, all under the age of 14. Partial completion of the Nauvoo temple allowed for about 6,000 people to attend the temple, And on January 22nd of 1846, Elizabeth had her temple work done. And many of the saints began their exodus from Nauvoo. At this time, Peter is 15 years old. Peter, with his mother, sisters, and brothers, moved on through Sugar Creek, winter quarters, and wound up in Pleasant Grove, where they stayed for a few years in order to make preparations to head out west. And this is where we picked up from last week. It was here in Pleasant Grove that Peter met Sophronia Hatch, and they started to make their plans and were married. Talks about just their time in Nauvoo. They remembered their homes, their farms, their orchards, the temple. They desired a place of refuge, and there was not one. Brigham Young sent a letter to President Polk, then President of the United States, in 1846, which said in part, "We would esteem a territorial government of our own as one of the richest boons on earth. And while we appreciate the Constitution of the United States as the most precious among the nations, we feel that we had rather retreat to the deserts, islands, or mountain caves than consent to be ruled by governors and judges whose hands are drenched in the blood of innocence and virtue, who delight in injustice and oppression." And with that, the saints, of course, left the United States and went out west. As we mentioned, Peter married Sophronia in 1852, and 2 months after their wedding, they were finally ready to start out west. Grandpa Hatch, Jeremiah Hatch, died just as they were getting ready to go. But Peter and Sophronia wound up with the Isaac M. Stewart Company as they traveled out west. They arrived in the Great Salt Lake area, and after about 2 weeks, both the Hatches and the Tidwells wound up in Ogden, Utah, and stayed there for about 10 years. They had many children. Of course, we descended from them. The Tidwells decided they would go up to Cache Valley. And they did that and settled into Smithfield, Utah in 1864. Now, Smithfield at that time was a fairly new development. It only had been settled since 1860. But it was at that time now that the Indians were starting to be a little more friendly. There could be homesteads established outside of a fort. And so Peter basically became a blacksmith. And it says he was a blacksmith of great skill, and he ran what was considered to be the only good blacksmith shop in Cache Valley for almost 20 years. And that would almost be where I'd end the story, but I did find one other little piece of information that I wanted to share with you. Last week being July 24th, many of you celebrate Pioneer Day, especially in the state of Utah, but in other parts it's not quite as well known. But the thing I found interesting was that Peter Tidwell was always one who would answer a call when it came. Even though it was his father and mother who joined the church and drug him around, he developed his own faith and testimony of the gospel. And there's a story that Peter Tidwell was a part of that I think you'll all recognize. In the late fall of 1856, there were 2 handcart companies that left the Nebraska Territory out of Florence, Nebraska, heading for the Salt Lake Valley. One was led by Captain James Willey, and the other was led by Captain Edward Martin. And they left on the 17th and the 27th of August of 1856, respectively. It was considered to be a little bit late in the year for them to head out. And these were made up mostly of both British and Scandinavian converts to the church. And they struggled on their way west. And as they crossed the North Platte River and were heading on to the Sweetwater near Devil's Gate, a terrible storm struck on the 19th of October. And of course, it's Mormon history on the Willey and Martin handcart companies. Brigham Young called for the saints who were already in Salt Lake to go to the rescue. And one of those who answered the call to go and help the Willie and Martin Handcart companies was a young man by the name of Peter Tidwell, who was then 25 years old, and he answered that cart and is remembered for helping in that rescue. Again, just another example of faith and service and sacrifice that we as descendants of both Peter and Sophronia can take pride in and look to their examples for determination and courage. I think that's a wonderful legacy that they've left behind. So again, thank you for stopping by. Really appreciate the efforts of these great grandparents of mine, and we'll talk to you again next time. Thanks for stopping by.